The moment I felt like I was being watched. Little did I know that that look would change my life forever. This happened in 2015, when I embarked on a road trip to a forest located a few hours away from me. There was a trail leading up to an abandoned fire lookout that I was eager to explore. It's worth noting that entering or camping inside it was technically illegal, as it wasn't maintained and could be structurally unsafe. However, after conducting some online research, I found that most people claimed it seemed fine. The latest post I could find about it was 3 years old, so I had no idea what to expect upon arrival. Eventually, I spotted a small ditch by the roadside where I could park. I grabbed my backpack, loaded with 2 days' worth of supplies, and began my hike. For trips like this, there are rarely defined paths, so I relied on a handheld satellite GPS to ensure I was heading the right way. Essentially, I was navigating through unfamiliar terrain in the woods. The hike from the road took about 4 to 5 hours. The deeper I went, the denser and rougher the landscape became. I was really hoping the fire lookout would still be intact and suitable for camping. If not, I figured I'd have to find another spot nearby to pitch my tent and sleep. After several exhausting hours of hiking, I finally reached my destination. I could see the structure peeking above the trees, and as I got closer, it appeared to be in decent condition. The paint had faded, of course, but it seemed sturdy. I gave the support beams a few pushes. They felt solid, so I decided to test my luck by climbing the ladder. It was metallic and seemed stable, though it creaked with every step. When I reached the top, I was momentarily awestruck by the view. I could see nearly the entire forest. There were no buildings, roads, or houses for miles in any direction, just endless woods. After soaking in the scenery, I walked around the ledge and stepped inside the lookout. It was quite small, not one of those large ones you see converted into airbnbs or similar. This was just a single room, perhaps 150 square feet, with a decaying bed in one corner and an old wooden desk in the other. Rotting windows lined the entire wall. There wasn't much else to inspect, so I set down my bag, unrolled my mattress and sleeping bag, and heated up a meal on my portable camping stove. As the sun began to set, I stepped out onto the ledge to watch it. It was one of the most breathtaking views I'd ever seen. However, it felt fleeting, and soon darkness enveloped the area. It was cloudy, so there was no moonlight or stars illuminating the sky. With nothing else to do, I stayed seated on the ledge for a while. It was probably an hour into the night when I noticed something below me, a light moving among the trees. What struck me as odd was that it wasn't an artificial light. It had an orange hue and flickered like a campfire. This made me think it might be a torch. The person carrying it moved between the trees, not far from where I was. The likelihood of someone else being out here at the same time as me, in such a remote part of the woods, was extremely slim, especially since there wasn't even a trail leading here. Additionally, wandering around at night without a flashlight and using a torch was peculiar. I watched as the light moved beneath the trees for a while before disappearing behind something, leaving me unable to see it anymore. For the next 30 minutes, it didn't reappear. Still, I remained on the ledge, taking in the serenity and silence of the night. Eventually, the wind picked up, making it slightly chilly, so I stood to take one last look before heading inside. But when I glanced below the ledge, someone was there. They were standing in the grassy area between the fire lookout and the woods, seemingly looking directly up at me. Perhaps it was the person with the light I had seen earlier. "Hello?" I called out, unsure of what else to say. They didn't move or respond. It was just this strange 10 or 15 seconds of us staring at each other before they raised their hand in acknowledgement or apology, then turned and walked into the woods, still without a light. Obviously, that was incredibly unsettling and eerie, but for some reason, in the moment, I convinced myself it was just another hiker wanting to stay in the lookout. They were likely trying to see if anyone was already inside. Why they hesitated to respond and only lifted their hand, I don't know. I stayed outside a little longer, but seeing nothing else, I went inside and got into my sleeping bag to warm up. It was somewhat difficult to fall asleep due to the wind hitting the windows and the wooden beams creaking beneath me, but eventually, I managed to drift off. It's hard to gauge how much time passed, but when I woke up, the wind had died down, and it was still pitch dark outside. I opened my eyes, wondering why I was suddenly awake, but then I heard a familiar sound, the soft metallic creak of the ladder outside. I sat up, thinking I must be mistaken, but then I heard it again and again. Someone was climbing the ladder. I couldn't tell how far up or down they were. I could only hear the hinges at the top of the ladder creak with each step. Outside the windows, it was completely dark. I unzipped my sleeping bag, got up, and grabbed my backpack, heart racing, as I stepped onto the ledge. During the 20 or so seconds it took to reach the ledge, the creaking grew louder and faster, as if they were hurrying, before abruptly stopping just as I made it outside. I stood frozen for a moment, waiting for another sound, then cautiously walked around the walkway and peered around the corner at the ladder opening. No one was there. I carefully approached, my heart pounding, and leaned over to look down. Nobody was on the ladder. For a second, I was in shock, confused, scared, and unsure of what was happening. Then, a sudden flurry of footsteps rushed around the wooden walkway behind me. I caught only a glimpse of a dark figure darting past the windows on the opposite side. Without hesitation, I lowered myself onto the ladder and hurried down. It was terrifying, trying to descend the slippery metal rungs while my whole body trembled from adrenaline, with someone chasing right above me. I was halfway down when I saw their head peek out from above. I didn't stop until I reached the bottom and fled into the woods. Honestly, I don't know why I even grabbed my backpack when I got up to investigate, but it turned out to be the best decision I ever made. It might have even saved my life. With my flashlight and GPS, I was able to navigate my way back to my car. As far as I know, I wasn't followed. I drove away and never looked back. I'm a 24-year-old woman from northern Arizona. This happened a few years ago. At the time, I was living out of a small camper van, traveling along the West Coast. There are many different lifestyles people choose to live in these types of vans or RVs. I always tried to avoid big cities and preferred camping in small towns between destinations. For the most part, though, I enjoyed camping in remote areas. Being surrounded by woods with no one else around made me feel most at ease and allowed me to fully embrace the traveling lifestyle. I think part of it was that it felt safer to be alone in the forest than stealth camping in a busy parking lot in the middle of a city. Don't get me wrong, it could still get eerie at night, but I always knew I was better off out there with no one around. That week, I was slowly traveling between two major cities in Washington. I took my time, sticking to back roads and staying at campsites for several days at a time. On this particular day, I turned off the road onto a narrow dirt trail leading deep into the forest. There were a few pull-off spots, but none were occupied, and it seemed like no one had been there in a while. So, I kept driving, hoping to find a larger, more scenic spot. At the end, there was a wide circular clearing. It wasn't scenic, just surrounded by trees, but it was spacious, secluded, peaceful, and even had a stone circle in the center for a campfire. I leveled out my van and parked. Since it was mid-spring, it rained almost every day in Washington, so there wasn't much for me to do outside. I opened the side door of my van to let in some fresh air while I cooked a meal on my propane stove. It was around sunset, so I still had several hours before bed. Over the next 30 minutes, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the rain began to intensify. I closed the door to keep the water out, and instead cracked open a small window near the back of the van. I sat on my bed and watched a show on my laptop. Midway through, a glare appeared on my screen, a light reflecting onto it. Before I could react, it disappeared. It didn't move away, it turned off, as if someone had switched it off. When I turned around and looked out the window, I saw nothing. It was pitch dark and still pouring outside. I had no way of knowing how far the light had come from or what it even was. Since I was on a trail with other pull-off spots, I assumed it was just another camper. Maybe their headlights had somehow found their way through the trees and shone into my window before they quickly turned off their vehicle. The only issue was that the light hadn't come from the road behind me. There were just trees. Maybe there was another trail I didn't know about. Either way, there wasn't much investigating I could do, so I turned back to my laptop. Occasionally, I'd glance out the windows or think I heard something outside, but with the rain clanking against the metal roof, it was hard to tell if I was actually hearing anything. Every time I looked, though, I never saw anything to confirm someone was out there, so I didn't worry too much. I decided to call it a night around 10 or 11 and tried to sleep. I turned off everything in the van, closed all the windows, and drew the shades. It was nearly pitch black inside. I got under the covers and tried to sleep. Usually, I didn't have much trouble falling asleep, but that night, I just couldn't manage it. Unfortunately, after an hour, the rain intensified, and thunder began rolling in. It was extremely loud and made it impossible to even attempt sleeping. About 2 hours into the night, amidst the relentless rain and thunder, I swear I heard something move outside. It was just loud enough for me to know I really heard it. It sounded like someone, or something, running and kicking over a branch on the ground near my van. As soon as I heard it, there were no other sounds. It was so dark I couldn't even see the ground beneath the window. The longer I stared out, the more uneasy I felt. I had this strange sensation that someone was looking back at me. I pulled the window cover back down and sat there, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. But only a minute later, I heard a voice. It was a male voice, kind of in a loud whisper, as if he were talking to someone else. I sat in silence, too scared to open the covers and look out the windows again, knowing they'd probably see me if they hadn't already. Though, they likely already assumed someone was in the van, which made it all the more terrifying. For a good 2 or 3 minutes, I didn't hear anything aside from the rain and thunder. Then, suddenly, there was movement outside the sliding side door of the van. It sounded like bending plastic, as if someone was leaning against the door. Then, there was a knock. A few seconds later, they knocked again. Even though I was sure they knew I was inside, I was still too scared to speak. Maybe they weren't certain how many people were inside or whether I was a man or a woman, so I felt safer giving them nothing and staying quiet. A very unsettling and anxious 5 minutes passed as the knocking continued every few seconds without anyone saying anything. They had to be drenched by now and probably couldn't see a thing in this weather. But then, they finally spoke. "Sheriff's Department, open up." I didn't believe that for a second. If it were true, why wouldn't they have said that from the beginning? They kept knocking and calling out similar lines, all basically stating they were an officer, and I needed to open the door. This seemed like a desperate attempt to get me to open up without resorting to violence. I slowly lifted the window cover and peeked out. All I could see was a dark figure moving near the door, but from the shape of it, he didn't appear to have any law enforcement gear on. I was certain things were about to get really bad. I debated in my head for 30 seconds as the knocking grew more impatient. Finally, I decided to risk getting into the driver's seat and driving away. As soon as I turned the car on, I heard 2 sets of footsteps running up to the side of the van. I began pulling out just as a figure appeared in the window next to me. Thankfully, the van didn't get stuck, and I was able to drive out onto the trail. As I drove away, I never saw another vehicle on the road, which made the intentions of these unknown individuals seem even more disturbing. I filed a report with the county, who, of course, claimed no officers were in the area that night. But I never received any follow-up. Things could have gotten really bad out there, but thankfully, I haven't experienced anything like that since. I spent the weekend camping at a small lake. Honestly, this wasn't meant to be anything special, just a few days in the woods by the water to unwind and nothing more. The first day was exactly that. I arrived, set up camp, and relaxed for the entire day and night. This place was pretty isolated, accessible only by a narrow footpath. It wasn't marked on any maps online, so it's likely only locals knew about it. My dad used to bring me here when I was a kid. Throughout all my visits to this spot, both as a child with my dad and as an adult on my own, I had never once encountered anyone else. Honestly, there were never even any signs of others having been there. On my second day, I spent my time walking around the lake, lost in thought. I must have circled it 3 or 4 times during those hours. Everything was peaceful and pleasant until, on one of my laps, I noticed footprints in the dirt near the edge of the tree line. I had walked the same path repeatedly and hadn't seen them before. Their location was so obvious that I doubt I could have missed them. They also appeared quite fresh. What struck me as odd wasn't just that someone else was out here. It was that these were barefoot prints, not shoe marks. The part of the lake I was at didn't have easy access to the water, so it wasn't as if someone had removed their boots to swim. Besides, I would have noticed them in the lake. Seeing those prints really unnerved me. Why hadn't I spotted anyone nearby while walking? Were they watching me and trying to avoid being seen? It was hard not to feel paranoid. From what I could tell, the footprints led up to the tree line, faced the lake, and then turned back into the woods, heading straight for a while. I didn't want to follow them into the unknown depths of the forest, so I returned to my campsite. I kept glancing toward the lake, or rather, the tree line surrounding it, checking if anyone was out there. I never saw anyone. As the sun began to set, the paranoia crept back in. Something about those footprints felt off. Knowing they were likely still nearby didn't help ease my unease. When it grew darker, I added more wood to my campfire and sat by it, trying to distract myself. But it was difficult. Part of me felt justified in feeling uneasy, while another part thought I was overreacting for no reason. Not long into the night, I heard footsteps approaching from the trees. I immediately turned toward the sound. There were multiple people. It sounded like 2 individuals slowly walking closer to my campsite. I stared in their direction until they suddenly stepped into the firelight. It was a man and a woman, standing side by side, stopping just at the edge of the light. I couldn't make out their faces or much detail beyond their general shapes. I couldn't even tell their age. "Can I help you?" As soon as I spoke, the woman turned and sprinted back into the woods, vanishing completely. But the man stayed put, unmoving and without looking back at her. That's when I looked down and realized he was barefoot. These were definitely the ones who had been by the lake. I asked again if I could assist him, but then he, too, turned and quietly retreated into the woods. After that, I had an internal meltdown. It was the most unsettling and bizarre encounter I'd ever experienced, almost surreal. I didn't want to stay in those woods for another second. I immediately started packing my things. I'm not the type to stick around when things get sketchy. Thankfully, my setup was simple to dismantle, so within minutes, everything was packed and ready to go. I didn't know where they had gone, but I didn't want to risk being there if they returned. I kicked out the unlit logs from the fire so it would burn out quickly after I left, then hurried into the woods. The hike was nearly 2 hours long. For the first 10 minutes, I was extremely tense, unsure if I was being followed. But the farther I got, the calmer I felt. About 40 minutes in, the entire forest fell silent. Not even crickets could be heard. Suddenly, I heard running footsteps nearby. They were distant, maybe 100 feet away, and unmistakably human. I couldn't see anything, so I just kept walking. Only a few minutes later, I heard it again, this time on the other side of me. The footsteps seemed quieter than expected, leading me to believe they were barefoot and that it was the same 2 people from the lake. If they had been stalking me this deep into the woods, who knows what they intended to do? For a while, I kept hearing bursts of running footsteps in the distance, short sprints as if they were quietly trailing me and then suddenly dashing away. I can't think of anything more terrifying than that walk through the woods. Somehow, though, I made it back to my truck and managed to leave. I wish I had more to share or that I had figured out who that man and woman were and what they were doing out there. But I have nothing. Maybe I'm losing my mind, but sometimes I wonder if they were even alive. I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to. I never went back.